And lastly, and I leave it lastly to Cuba because it's one that's been more enduring, the problem in Cuba basically is that despite being a communist regime and Marxism not working, is that they've decided, and they thought what they would do is that they would create this holding company. It's called GAESA. It is a company that they own by the Cuban military, and that holding company owns everything that makes money in Cuba. If it makes money in Cuba, they own it, and it generates revenue for them. The Miami Herald just did an expose on GAESA. And while you have electrical blackouts and you have all these other problems economically in Cuba, GAESA is sitting on billions of dollars that they've generated for their permanency. In 2017, the Trump administration sanctioned GAESA. Unfortunately, the Biden administration lifted some of those sanctions and restrictions a couple of years ago, which increased the amount of money they're able to generate through things like manipulating remittances and the like. And then yesterday, the Biden administration announced they were rescinding all of the sanctions on GAESA, which basically the sanctions were this. You can do business with an independent individual Cuban, but you cannot, it's the regime that doesn't allow it. You cannot do business with anything owned by that government-run entity. And yesterday they lifted the sanctions on them. Now, the new administration is not bound by that decision, but nonetheless that's what's in place. Ultimately, the reality, the moment of truth is arriving. Cuba is literally collapsing, both generationally in terms of all the young people leaving, but it's also collapsing economically. They are now living on 20 and 21-hour rolling blackout and some days longer because Marxism doesn't work, because they're corrupt, and because they're inept. And they're going to have a choice to make, those that are in charge there. Do they open up to the world? Do they allow the individual Cuban to have control over their economic and political destiny, even though it threatens the security and stability of the regime? Or do they triple down and just say, we'd rather be the owners and controllers of a fourth world country that's falling apart and has lost 10% of its population in the last 2 years? And that's a dynamic that they're facing right now. I hope that they will choose the path of empowering the individual Cuban so that the individual Cuban has the ability to do what the peoples of virtually every other country in the hemisphere have been able to do at least once in the last 60 years, and some more than once, and that is elect their leaders, vote for their leaders. You think about what happened here today. The Cuban people have no idea what it's like to have an authority figure or someone in charge and power, like I am as a U.S. Senator, sitting here having to answer questions from his colleagues, and also having to have people in the back screaming and protesting against you. You can't do that to a Cuban official. You can't question their decisions. The Cuban people have never been able to participate in a political process for almost 70 years now, and they're entitled to that as much as the people of Colombia and Argentina and Paraguay and Peru and virtually every other country in the region has enjoyed.